Hello and welcome. I'm Francois Picard. On the eve of Francois Hollande's first trip to Africa as French president, you're about to hear his reasons for going to the summit of Francophone nations in Kinshasa, this despite misgivings over DR Congo's human rights records. Many of the world's French-speaking nations are former colonies in Africa. That special relationship, certainly unique. It's often described as murky. We'll hear the new French president on that, plus on the jihadist threat out of northern Mali, the conflict in Syria, and the controversial role of Qatar, both there and in France. Francois Hollande speaking this Thursday at the presidential palace to France 24's Roselyne Febvre, Radio France International's Jean-Karim Fall, and TV5's David Delous.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président.
Hello, Mr. President.
Good evening.
Thank you for accepting this interview with France 24, RFI, and TV5 Monde. Also conducting the interview with me are Jean-Karim Fall from RFI, hello, Mr. President, and David Delous from TV5 Monde. You have hesitated for a long time to go to Kinshasa and the Francophone Summit. Though Tuesday you stated that the Democratic Republic of Congo's record was unacceptable as far as rights, democracy, and recognition of the opposition were concerned. So a country not to be visited, why are you now going to Kinshasa? And have you since received any guarantees?
First, I'm going to Kinshasa because it is Africa, and because I want to say to Africans who speak French that we are extremely grateful for them. The French language is an African language. We already see today that French is most spoken in Africa, and I'd like to thank them for that. I'm going to Kinshasa because the DRC is a great country, it's a large country, and it is threatened at its borders. As president, I am also going in order to say what I have already said in front of the United Nations General Assembly. I will not accept that the borders of this great country be threatened by foreign aggression. I am also going to Kinshasa, to Africa, and before Kinshasa to Dakar in Senegal, to speak of honesty, transparency, and respect. There were elections last year in DRC. They were not seen as completely satisfactory. But progress has been made, and I want to underscore that. A commission for an electoral commission, a commission for human rights. So every time I go somewhere, I want it to be a symbol of the fact that France's presence means progress in democracy.
However, some of the guarantees you hoped for have not been provided, such as transparency on the murder trial of human rights activist Florent Chabayel, killed in 2010. Now, from that standpoint, will you express regrets?
I will have the opportunity to speak there. In Kinshasa, I will say what I say everywhere. What I say here in France. I don't have different speeches depending on the audience that I speak to. I don't have different ways of expressing myself. I know that this trial is expected. He was an activist who was assassinated, and his family, his friends and loved ones have called out for justice, and I will have a chance to speak about it with President Kabila. Times have changed. France today wishes to both respect all of its partners and also to be very forthright. This truth is not France's truth, it is the truth of the fundamental rights, freedoms, and democracy.
You will be meeting the Congo opposition party leader Etienne Tshisekedi at the residence of France in Kinshasa. What will you be saying to him? He's calling for demonstrations. Are you worried about that?
A number of major non-governmental organizations that I spoke to before deciding whether or not to go to Kinshasa shared with me their points of view. They advised me to go to Kinshasa, to go to DRC, because it was a Francophone summit, and thus it was my responsibility to be there on behalf of France and the French people, but also for Africa, to send a message, to speak with all stakeholders of this great republic, because the DRC is a great nation, one of the largest in Africa.
Though its democracy is stalled.
with a population which hopes for democracy, with rules which are not yet entirely satisfactory. So I will discuss that with President Kabila, and I will meet with him. And I also wished to meet with the opposition, with the main party. I was going to say the main historic opponent. I will see him, I will see others, non-governmental organizations, not in order to interfere. I am not going there in order to be a referee, in order to be a judge. That is not what France is asked to do. We are defining a new policy. We have respect and consideration, but we say things clearly. Because what I want is to make my visit contribute to the democratic process in order to achieve
Well,
its
along
goals.
those lines, is your meeting with Etienne Tshisekedi a message to the authorities?
It's a message sent to all heads of state in Africa. I take them into consideration. I am aware when they were elected through a democratic process that they fully represent their country. When they were not elected in such a way, I tried to maintain good relations between states, but I also recognize the opponents when they operate within a democratic process, when they want to contribute without violence to make the polls speak.
Let's come back to your first step in Dakar in Senegal. Recall in 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy's address shocked Africans, where he said the Africans weren't embracing progress enough. Will 2012 and President Hollande's be the address of reparations?
No, I am not going in order to give a speech to erase a previous speech. I'm going there in order to give a speech to start a new page in history with Africa. France and Africa have historic relations, and we have a recognition of what Africa has brought. We have to also remember the mistakes that were made, colonization and the slave trade. The new page will be to see Africa as a continent which is moving towards the future, which sees a great deal of growth. In Europe, we suffer from recession. Some of our neighboring countries are in a recession. We have slow growth. There is a great deal of dynamic growth in Africa. There is a youth which wants to have a place. There are businesses setting up in Africa, countries which have invested.
China and the US.
China, the United States. So I'm going to tell Africans that we want to be with you in this great new adventure, and to tell young people in Africa that we want to speak to you with our language, sometimes with another language when it is spoken by English speakers. But we are coming here to develop a relationship built on trust and on mutual consideration.
On economic issues, you've said that Africa is the fastest growing continent. But do you not fear your economic diplomacy may run up against the very principles you put forward?
Economic diplomacy means making it possible for our businesses to have their place. They have a place in Africa. 20% of Africa's economy is linked to French companies. That's quite a share. That's quite a presence already. But I don't want there to be go-betweens and facilitators, intermediaries, that we would bring along.
Even in the oil industry?
There may be large companies like Total, but every time I'm asked, I say I want Total to be able to have contracts, but in a transparent process. What I want to achieve is that all industries in the mining sector, forestry sector, and others operate with complete transparency in every country they are in. And I've spoken with the president of Total. He's ready to do it. He's already doing it. So yes, we can defend our economic interests, but without a different type of diplomacy.
You've alluded to France-Afrique and the obscure networks between Paris and the African countries. Nicolas Sarkozy promised an end to these networks. And since you're swearing in, you have hosted a good half a dozen heads of state from Africa, and some of them from France Afrique, some involved even in some of the affairs that are called ill-gotten gains. Now, where is the real breakaway?
I am aware that with regards to the ill-gotten gains, the French justice system is doing its work and is unhindered. There is one country in particular, one family in particular, that the focus is on. The justice system will go to the end and will reach its decision. I am not the one who works on the case. It is important for Africans to be able to know what happened to these funds. I also welcome heads of state from around the world. Those who ask to meet me can meet me. I also go to meet with them. They're not always from democracies. I'm sorry that's the case. But I have relationships between states. Anytime I welcome a head of state, be it from Africa or from another continent, I always speak about the situation in their country, not in order to intervene or meddle, but because I owe them that honesty. When an opponent is stepped on, when freedoms are stepped on, when protests are banned, or when there's repression, then I speak about it. But I also try to move forward on files in Africa or for our businesses.
We'll come to Mali in a moment, but one question. What you're saying, in a way, is that this normalization of African policy could lead to a loss of influence for France?
On the contrary, I would like to banish this word, the normalization. It has a different dimension. It's an outdated word. New policies that are respectful and transparent.
Normal is the trendy word. And the previous policy wasn't enough?
Not enough, because it was criticized. We spoke about a France-Africa. There will be France and Africa. We won't need to mix the two words. Further, I want our economic interests to be defended, of course, that's normal, but I would also like to see public procurement that is open and transparent. When we have companies for which I'm very happy and I support them, so companies who decide to invest in an African country, for instance, and that manage to gain the trust of their host countries, then those businesses need to be fully transparent, and part of their profits need to be present, need to be invested in the countries where their activity is.
Mali will be of paramount interest during your visit in Africa. The UN Security Council is examining the resolution on military intervention in Mali. You've been discussing with Ban Ki-moon in Paris. He wants negotiations and discussions first. You want to move faster. Is there not a timetable issue? Are you on the same wavelength? To speak with whom? With terrorists who have set up their bases in northern Mali, who are imposing Sharia law and cutting off people's hands, who are destroying monuments which have been named as part of the global heritage of humanity. Speaking with Akim, can we really imagine there to be useful conversations there? If there are political forces, secular ones, and they exist in northern Mali, who want to take part in national reconciliation, that is the responsibility of the Mali authorities, and I will not stand in their way. On the other hand, what I want to do, and not on behalf of France, but on behalf of peace, on behalf of human rights, is to achieve a resolution at the United Nations, at the Security Council, over the next few days on a principle, the principle of an armed force that could be deployed in the region, and then another resolution later by the Security Council on defining that force. Do you think this vote can get past Chinese and Russian veto? Might Moscow and Beijing have an interest in opposing military intervention?
No, because the fight against terrorism is a shared purpose for all great nations. They know the risks involved for the local populations, for the entire Sahel region, for the states, but also for our own countries, because we can be affected by terrorism by the terrorists who have set up their bases in the Sahel, trafficking drugs and weapons coming from Libya, and who are making the most of this traffic in order to finance their heinous goals, and who are currently fully occupying the region. I think at the Security Council there will be a common will to set up this strike force. But I have to be extremely clear, it is up to Africans to decide. It is the Mali government, the president and prime minister together, who asked for help. It is ECOWAS who will have to organize this force with the African Union. I'd like to applaud the activity, the work and effort of the president of the African Union in setting this up. And of course, we will work with our partners. We will respect international law. If we are asked to provide logistical support, equipment, information, then we will provide it. But there will be...
With no troops on the ground?
There will be no troops on the ground, no French troops, one way or another.
What about air support?
We have not been asked.
Well, what if they ask for air support?
We cannot intervene instead of Africans.
Troops.
I want to be extremely clear. We can provide material support, we can provide training, but we will not intervene. France will not intervene.
But, Mr. President, France cannot intervene. Well, we couldn't have a military intervention in Mali without Algeria's active support, whereas they are proning discussion and a diplomatic solution. In a couple of weeks, you will be going to Algiers. What can you do to encourage President Abdelaziz Bouteflika to get involved militarily if there is an intervention in Mali?
Algeria has already suffered much in fighting terrorism. Thus, I have no reason to teach them any lessons. They know the threat. On the other hand, it's true that Algeria today has been observing the situation with a certain level of distance and caution. So I have to reassure Algerians that what is going to happen is going to be done by Africans. It is fighting terrorists, not occupying territory, and it is up to the people of Mali to decide. This very day, there was a great protest in Bamako. People have gone down into the streets to call to restore their national integrity, to fight against terrorism. We have to listen to what the people of Mali and the authorities in Mali are saying, that they want to have the integrity of their territory. Today, women are raped, children are enrolled, men are massacred. As I said before, monuments are profaned.
We hear a lot about this African force. There are some 3,000 troops. Now, are these enough to cover such a large territory? We talk about something twice the size of France?
You are right. We are not just going to have a military intervention, but we also have to restore stability to the region, to allow the people to regain a sense of normalcy in their everyday lives. We have to have proper governing of the region. So we are willing and ready to support with equipment and through our help. But it is up to the authorities in Mali to find a long-lasting solution. This is why I underscore the aid that we can provide, not just equipment, but aid to Mali, but to the entire region, to Niger and Mauritania and others, in order to improve their opportunities for development. There is a crisis today. There are many crises, in fact, food crisis, hygiene crisis, and more. We have to help these countries overcome this.
What type of aid would it be? Equipment, material, training, ground assistance?
Let's distinguish between different types of help to the country. Europe has been doing a great deal, not just France, but all of Europe, and I want to applaud this. Europe has been providing support to development to countries that have been affected by what we call the Sahel crisis. As regards the operation that could be decided on by the Security Council, that would be set up by Africans, by ECOWAS and the African Union. Once again, France will provide logistical support, will provide some equipment, and will provide training for the staff which will be potentially sent to that part of Mali.
Now, we've seen in France there are Islamist cells. One has been dismantled recently. Now, by declaring war against Hakim, do you not fear a risk of drawing terrorists into France? As we've seen, this type of terrorism from within is a real threat.
It is by allowing Hakim, let's not forget this is Al-Qaeda, by allowing them to prosper in the Sahel, that I will create a risk for my country, because that is where terrorism may come from. We learned that there were French citizens in Mali, just as there are in Somalia, just as we can find them in Syria, and who can decide afterwards to come back to their home country with terrorist goals. This is unacceptable. Therefore, we have to cut off the path to terrorists. In order to do that, we have to have an international approach, which is the one that I am defending in Mali. There are also terrorists who may be present here in France. They may not be connected to other parts of the world, and we have to be aware of that as well. We have to be vigilant, and that is what we saw with the arrest of a certain number of people, who, many of whom today have been brought to trial, and we will continue the investigation to the end, because we have to protect our people, and the government's responsibility is to watch over everything, to notice everything, to identify everything, to make sure there is no option for terrorism.
Do you not think that the military intervention in Mali could risk jeopardizing the lives of the French hostages held in the Islamic Maghreb in the north of Mali?
We have 6 hostages. There are 6 French hostages in Mali. 4 of them, as we refer to them often, the Arlit hostages, and the other 2 who were captured 2 years ago. We have been trying everything we can, using all of the contacts we can, to free them. A video was released a few days ago. We are trying to understand the messages that we have been provided and having as many contacts as we can. I cannot say more about it, but please understand, France's position. Do you think France's position can be dependent on a hostage taking? We have 2 responsibilities. First, freeing our hostages. The second, freeing Mali from terrorists.
Are they not contradictory?
No, they're not contradictory. On the contrary, I think that hostage takers know full well what can happen, and this may set them in a mindset to try to release our citizens as soon as possible. I am here in front of you. I am speaking to everyone, and I hope that they can hear me if they are watching their televisions or listening to the radio. We want our hostages released, and we will do whatever we have to achieve
Mr. President, do you think that in France we have a radical Islamic movement that's anti-Western and anti-Semitic? Recently, the Israeli community was targeted. Should they be worried?
First, there are Muslims. There are Muslims who want to practice their religion peacefully in our democracy, respectful of others, in a spirit of tolerance which this religion has embodied historically. So we must not confuse them with others. There are cells. I don't yet know how large or numerous. The investigations are underway, but who want to turn radical Islam into a source of hatred and aggression. We will not leave them alone. We will hunt them down.
Are you declaring war on Hakim and terrorists?
I'm not going to use words that would allow people to think that that is the situation. We are simply vigilant, we are watchful, and we are firm. And let me reassure you that we are not going to leave any stone unturned. We are going to do everything to be present.
Mr. President, Qatar is about to invest 50 million euros in France, and particularly in the suburbs. Is this type of unprecedented cooperation opportune at this current time?
This announcement was made by Qatar before the elections. I'm sure that the initiative was made in a positive spirit to help our suburbs, to support talent. There is a great deal of talent, businesses that are created and have prospered.
Your minister approved it, didn't he?
Yes, but I've suggested alternative methods. If Qatar wants to invest in our suburbs in France, great, let's accept that proposal. But let's do that together. Let's set up a fund, a joint fund, a Franco-Qatari fund, which will be set up through the French Savings Bank, and decisions will be taken together. A single country will not determine what talent or what business will be supported. We'll do it together.
Could there be a loss of sovereignty, though?
We have a similar fund with China. Anytime a small or large country, typically it's richer countries who decide to invest rather than poorer ones, but whenever a country comes to us and says, we would like to invest, we will say, great, let's do it together. Because we can tell you what is strategic, what isn't, what can be useful for you, what can be useful to us.
But, Mr. President, Qatar has a bit of a murky role. We see it in Syria today, where it seems that many Syrian rebels are armed and financed by Qatar, which will bring me to another question on Syria later, but there is a bit of a murky role there for Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Mali as well.
Let's be as accurate as possible. That is your role and that is my responsibility. Qatar has supported opposition to Bashar al-Assad.
But there are many oppositions.
And before that, they supported the Assad government. They now want to help the opposition. What we are saying is we have to gather together the opposition and organize them so as to prepare for the post-Assad period. And in order for the country to be able to move towards democracy, not chaos, the opposition needs to bring together all of the movements within and without who would like to build a free and democratic Syria in the future. Qatar has a part to play and it can provide support, and that is fine. But as far as we're concerned, there is no way that we are going to provide weapons to rebels when we don't know what...
But those recognized by our services, those who have freed territories.
Well, we don't know what they plan. Well, for the freed territories, I've asked for those to be protected. I've said to the Qatari who invest not just there but elsewhere as well, including in Mali, they provide humanitarian aid. I've told my counterparts in Qatar, be careful. Sometimes you think you're providing humanitarian aid, but without meaning to, you end up providing financing to initiatives which can help terrorists. They answered me. The Qatari authorities, the Emir and his Prime Minister, replied that they are extremely vigilant, and I believe them. But I'm completely vigilant.
Did you ask them to participate in this broad coalition that's being set up to take Mali back?
It's not up to me to determine who should or should not participate. I've simply said that Africans needed to take the initiative for that. Africans and only Africans.
Mr. President, last question here now on Syria. The situation is completely stalled because of the Russian-Chinese veto. Meanwhile, the international community is happy to just condemn and they're dithering about, but do you not fear a post-Bashar void that could be as big a concern as the current situation, similar to a sort of post-Saddam Iraq, interprofessional conflict that would be every bit as uncontrollable?
The earlier Bashar leaves, the more secure the transition will be in Syria. The longer the conflict lasts, the greater the risk of a civil war, the risk of chaos afterwards, or of a division. And this is unacceptable. France was at the forefront. Over the last few months, we have been very active. Look at what has happened since my election. We called for a united opposition, which was done here in Paris, and to become organized in a provisional government. We were the first to call for that. We were also the first to call for protection of freed regions. We were also the first to call for humanitarian aid. This is what we do in Jordan, for instance. And we were the first to state that displaced and individuals and refugees need to be given shelter for the coming winter. We have been the first to call for any measures to be taken for al-Assad to leave We have even considered proposals to have someone close to al-Assad who would provide a transition. We have heard Turkey's proposals. There are members of the entourage who could, but there's no compromise with Assad.
You mentioned Turkey. Syria's conflict is spilling over its borders into Turkey. Do you not fear an escalation and an armed conflict between Ankara and Damascus?
This is a risk. Turkey has been particularly cool-headed, and I would like to applaud its leaders because there has been aggression, there have been provocations. Turkey has done everything it can to avoid the situation spinning out of control. Syria has in its interest to create an international conflict which might bring its population together against foreign aggressors. We have to do whatever we can to ensure that the Syrian conflict, the Syrian revolution, not spill beyond its borders.
A civil war.
In Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. It is a vast responsibility. France is committed to Lebanon preserving its integrity. I also support what is taking place in Jordan. There is a democratic process engaged in Jordan, and there are also a large number of refugees.
Have you discussed this with your Russian and Chinese counterparts?
Of course, with Mr. Putin. I had a lengthy discussion with Mr. Putin. I told him, and therefore I can repeat it to you, I told him that if what you want is to avoid chaos, and we agree that that's a goal, to avoid chaos, fundamentalism, terrorism. You want to avoid Syria turning into a place of chaos and a breeding ground for dangerous groups, then the sooner you stop supporting Assad, the better your chances of avoiding that happening.
But are we sure about these Syrian rebels? This is a very fractured rebellion from jihad fighters to SLA and others we're not even aware of. Now, should France and or Western countries not arm the identified rebels and to protect against massive bombings and also to prevent weapons from falling into the wrong hands?
Well, that is the very heart of the problem. When you provide weapons, you never know where they'll end up. Let's look at Libya, for example. What is happening today in Mali is because weapons were delivered without a clear framework to Libya, and then those weapons moved. And where did they end up? In regions where they could be purchased cheaply. And today I am extremely vigilant in the name of the fight against Bashar al-Assad for democracy. We mustn't do anything that could strengthen terrorism.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for granting us this interview. Thank you, Jean-Karim, and thank you, David Delos.
Thank you.
And there you saw it, Francois.